Imagine you are standing on the shore of the ocean at the end of the 15th century. Europe back then was completely different, cramped, closed off, full of rumors about fabulous lands somewhere beyond the horizon. People believed that somewhere there, at the edge of the world, rivers of gold flowed, trees with precious fruits grew, and local residents walked around in silks. This was a time when a dream was worth more than maps, because there were hardly any maps at all. In those years, trade with the East went through intermediaries, Arab merchants, Venetians, Genoese. Each took their share, each inflated the price. Pepper, which cost pennies in its homeland, was sold in Europe by weight of gold. And so, some adventurers began to think, what if we tried to sail to India directly, bypassing all these intermediaries? Only not eastward across the land, where caravans are robbed and duties are levied, but westward across the ocean. One of these dreamers was a Genoese named Christopher Columbus, a short, reddish-haired sailor with burning eyes and iron confidence in his righteousness. He believed that the earth was round. Many educated people of that time, by the way, believed this. The myth about a flat earth appeared much later. Columbus simply made a calculation error, deciding that the distance from Europe to Asia across the ocean was a stone's throw. In reality, he underestimated the size of the planet by almost twofold. But sometimes, errors change the world more strongly than precise calculations. For long years, Columbus went around royal courts, begging for money for an expedition. The Portuguese refused. The English were not interested. Finally, the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, agreed. They had just recaptured the last Moorish lands in southern Spain and were in high spirits. Moreover, their rivals, the Portuguese, were already mastering the route to India around Africa, and the Spanish were very eager not to fall behind. On the morning of the 3rd of August, 492, 3 small ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina, left the Spanish port of Palos. 90 people in the crew, supplies of hardtack, salted meat, and water. They were sailing into the unknown, and many sailors were sure they would not return. The ocean seemed endless. After a month of sailing, the crew began to grumble, demanding to turn back. Columbus had to lie, understating the distance traveled in the ship's log to avoid frightening the men. On the 12th of October, after more than 2 months at sea, the lookout from the Pinta shouted, "Land!" It was an island in the Caribbean Sea, which Columbus named San Salvador. He was certain he had reached the islands off the coast of India, which is why he called the local inhabitants Indians, a name that stuck for centuries, although it was absolutely incorrect. And now let's look at this meeting through the eyes of those who had lived here long before the arriving Europeans. Tens of millions of people inhabited these lands, by some estimates, from 50 million to 100 million people. These were not the savages in loincloths from school textbooks, but peoples with a 1,000-year history, developed cultures, and complex societies. In the south of the Mexican lands lived the descendants of the great Maya, who built stone cities with astronomical observatories. In the mountains ruled the Incas, an empire stretching for thousands of kilometers along the Pacific coast, with roads, bridges, and a system of governance that many European kingdoms might envy. In the north of modern Mexico, the Aztec Empire was gaining strength, with its capital Tenochtitlan, a city on a lake, exceeding most European capitals of that time in size. On the Caribbean islands and in the coastal areas lived simpler peoples, fishermen, farmers, who grew maize, cassava, and squash. They did not know iron, but they knew how to process gold and jade. They sailed in large canoes between the islands, traded, fought, and told stories around bonfires under the palms. For them, the appearance of bearded men on huge floating houses was a shock, but not yet a horror. The first contacts were peaceful. Columbus described the locals as kind, generous, and trusting. They gave the Europeans parrots, cotton threads, and darts with bone tips. In return, they received glass beads, copper bells, and red caps. It seemed the era of friendship and mutually beneficial trade was beginning. But this was only the beginning of a clash between two worlds that would change both sides forever. Columbus returned to Spain a hero, bringing with him gold dust, unseen birds, strange plants, and several Indians whom he presented at court as curiosities. News of the new lands spread across Europe instantly. The Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, everyone suddenly realized that something huge, unexplored, and potentially very, very profitable lay beyond the ocean. New expeditions began. Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine navigator, explored the eastern coast of South America and was the first to realize this is not Asia. This is an entirely new continent. His name was eventually given to these lands, America. The Spanish began to call themselves conquistadors, conquerors, and moved deep into the continent in search of gold, glory, and new lands for the crown. Thus began the era that would later be called the Great Age of Discovery. But for the millions of people living on the other side of the ocean, it was the beginning of a catastrophe. Epidemics, wars, enslavement, and the destruction of their civilizations. And for Europe, the beginning of the path to global dominance and wealth that would change its economy, culture, and the very perception of the world. Two worlds collided, and nothing could ever go back. After the Spanish began to develop the southern lands of the new continent, enriching themselves with silver and gold, other European powers also wanted their share. The English watched the successes of their neighbors for a long time and finally decided to act. But their path to America began far from triumphantly, rather with a series of failures, starvation, and despair. In the spring of 1607, 3 English ships approached the shores of Virginia. On board were more than 100 men, mostly gentlemen, minor nobles, adventurers, who had no idea how to survive in the wild. They founded the settlement of Jamestown, the first permanent English colony in North America. And they almost all perished. Imagine this. These people expected to find gold, like the Spanish in Mexico. Instead, they found swamps, mosquitoes, hostile Indians, and a complete lack of food. Many of the colonists were people of noble birth who considered it beneath their dignity to work with their hands. They wasted time searching for gold while their supplies dwindled. The first winter was a nightmare. Of 104 people, only 38 survived. They ate rats, leather belts. There is even evidence of cannibalism, a period they called the starving time. Jamestown survived by a miracle. They were helped by the Powhatan Indians, led by a wise chief named Wahunsinakaw. His daughter, Pocahontas, whom you surely know from the cartoon, did indeed help the colonists, although the real story was much more complex and sadder than the animated version. And in the end, it wasn't gold that saved the colony, but tobacco. One of the settlers, named John Rolfe, began growing tobacco, and it turned out to be a gold mine. Tobacco was highly valued in Europe. Virginia became a tobacco plantation, and things improved. Now let's move a little further north, to where the history unfolded quite differently. In the autumn of 1620, a small ship named the Mayflower crossed the Atlantic. On board were just over 100 people, Puritans fleeing religious persecution in England. They were called separatists because they separated from the Anglican Church, considering it too Catholic in spirit. These people dreamed of a place where they could worship as they saw fit, without the oversight and oppression of the king and bishops. They landed in December, in the midst of winter, on a desolate shore they named Plymouth. Half of them died in the first months from cold, hunger, and disease. But those who survived did not give up. In the spring, they were helped by an Indian named Squanto, who knew English and taught the colonists how to grow corn, fish, and hunt local game. In the autumn, they gathered their first harvest and held a feast together with the Wampanoag Indians. This event became the basis for Thanksgiving Day, which Americans still celebrate. Gradually, English colonies grew in number. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island in the north. Maryland, founded by Catholics. Pennsylvania, where Quakers settled, another religious group seeking freedom of worship. The Carolinas and Georgia in the south. By the middle of the 18th century, a chain of 13 colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast. And from the very beginning, these colonies were very different. In the north, in New England, settled farmers, artisans, and merchants. The climate there was cold, the land rocky, unsuitable for large plantations. But they could build ships, fish, and trade with Europe and the West Indies. Northerners created societies based on family farms where everyone worked themselves. Towns grew around churches and schools. Puritans took education very seriously. They believed that every Christian should be able to read the Bible. Therefore, Harvard College appeared there only a few years after the founding of Massachusetts.
In the South, everything developed differently. The climate there was warm, the land fertile, an ideal place for growing tobacco, rice, and later cotton. Huge plantations arose, requiring many working hands. Initially, they tried to use hired workers from England, but there were few of them. They quickly gained freedom and left to establish their own farms. And then the planters turned to another source of labor, slaves from Africa. The first ship with African slaves arrived in Virginia back in 1619. Initially, their status was uncertain, something between servants and slaves. But gradually, the system tightened. By the end of the 17th century, slavery became hereditary, lifelong, and based on skin color. Southern colonies turned into societies where wealthy planters lived in luxury by exploiting the labor of thousands of enslaved Africans. This system brought enormous wealth to the plantation owners, but laid a bomb under the country's future. A bomb that would explode a century and a half later in a civil war. Relations with the indigenous population also developed differently. In some places, colonists traded with Indians, learned from them, and even made alliances. But more often, the English hunger for land led to conflicts. The Indians did not understand the European concept of land ownership. For them, the land was common, like air or water. The English, however, wanted to fence plots, own them, and pass them down by inheritance. Clashes were inevitable, and usually they ended in tragedy for the Indians. They were pushed further and further into the continent, their lands transferring to new owners. By the middle of the 18th century, the colonies were no longer pathetic settlements on the edge of civilization. Boston, Philadelphia, New York turned into real cities with thousands of residents, shipyards, printing houses, taverns, and theaters. Colonial merchants grew rich on trade with the West Indies. They carried fish and timber there and returned with sugar and molasses. Some participated in the triangular trade. They carried rum to Africa, exchanged it for slaves, sold the slaves in the Caribbean Sea, bought sugar and molasses there, carried it to New England, where they made rum, and so on, in a cycle. A dirty but profitable business. Relations with the mother country, with England, were complex. On the one hand, the colonists were proud of being English, subjects of the crown. On the other hand, they were accustomed to a certain freedom. There was no feudal system in the colonies, no hereditary aristocracy. Any hardworking person could get rich, buy land, and become a respected member of society. These were societies with much greater social mobility than in Europe, and the colonists jealously guarded their rights and privileges
from any attempts by London to restrict them. This independence of spirit, this feeling that they were building something of their own, something new, something better, it would grow and strengthen until it led to a break. Sometimes victory itself becomes the beginning of problems. In the middle of the 18th century, Britain won a major war, the one called the 7 Years' War, although in America it was called the French and Indian War. The English defeated the French, taking Canada and all lands east of the Mississippi from them. A huge victory, huge territories, and huge debts. The war cost the British Treasury a fortune. The King and Parliament in London looked at the map and decided, since we fought for the American colonies, defended them from the French and Indians, let the colonists pay for it. Sounds logical, right? Only the colonists viewed it completely differently. They believed they handled things perfectly well on their own, that the war was waged in Britain's own interests, and anyway, they were already paying enough. It started with small things. First, the Stamp Act, a tax on any printed documents, from newspapers to playing cards. Then, taxes on glass, lead, paints, paper, and the most offensive, the tax on tea. The colonists were seething. Angry speeches sounded in taverns and city squares. The organization Sons of Liberty appeared, uniting the hottest heads. Their slogan sounded simple and powerful. No taxation without representation. If we pay taxes, they said, we must have our representatives in the British Parliament, and since we are not there, it means we won't pay the taxes. The British didn't understand what the problem was. Parliament, they said, represents all subjects of the Crown, wherever they live. Virtual representation, it was called. The colonists spat on such logic. Virtual? They needed real people, elected by themselves, defending their interests. Tension grew. A clash occurred in Boston between townspeople and British soldiers. 5 colonists were killed. This event was dubbed the Boston Massacre, although in reality it was more of a brawl that got out of control. But the name stuck, and it enraged people even more. And then the Tea Party happened. On a winter evening, the 16th of December, 1773, a group of men dressed in Indian costumes sneaked onto 3 British ships anchored in Boston Harbor. They worked all night, opening crates and dumping the tea overboard. About 45 tons of tea, a fortune, ended up in the water. This was not a spontaneous impulse of a drunken crowd. Everything was organized, disciplined, almost military style. Nothing but the tea was touched. Even a lock, accidentally broken on one ship, was later fixed and returned. London flew into a rage. Parliament passed a series of laws that the colonists immediately dubbed the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was closed until the damage was reimbursed. Self-governance of Massachusetts was effectively abolished.
British officials accused of crimes could be tried in England, not in the colonies. This was punishment designed to put the unruly in their place. But the effect was the opposite. Other colonies saw the fate of Massachusetts as a threat to themselves. If they were punished today, we might be punished tomorrow. For the first time, the 13 scattered colonies felt themselves to be a single entity. In the autumn of 1774, the First Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia. 55 delegates from 12 colonies. Only Georgia did not send its representatives. They argued for a long time about what to do. Radicals like Samuel Adams demanded a break with Britain. Moderates hoped for reconciliation. In the end, they adopted a petition to the king demanding the repeal of unjust laws and respect for the rights of the colonists. But simultaneously, they called for a boycott of British goods and began preparing for defense. In the spring of the following year, patience ran out completely. The British general stationed in Boston with troops learned that the colonists were storing weapons in the town of Concord. He sent a detachment to confiscate it.
On the night of the 19th of April, 75, two riders, Paul Revere and William Dawes, galloped to warn the militiamen. "The redcoats are coming," they shouted, knocking on the doors of farmhouses. At dawn, on the village green in Lexington, 70 militiamen stood in formation before a column of British soldiers. Who fired first is still unknown, but a shot rang out, then another and another. 8 militiamen killed, 10 wounded. The British went on to Concord. Resistance was stiffer there, and on the way back to Boston, they were pursued by hundreds of militiamen, shooting from behind stone fences, from house windows, from the woods. The British suffered heavy losses. This was no longer a skirmish. This was war.
The Second Continental Congress gathered in May and made a fateful decision to create the Continental Army. A tall Virginian planter named George Washington was appointed commander. But even then, many hoped for peace. They sent yet another petition to the king. George III did not even read it. "The colonists are rebels," he declared, "and they must be treated accordingly." Then the most radical delegates decided, enough. Clarity is needed. In the summer of 1776, Congress instructed 5 people to draft a document explaining to the world why the colonies should become independent. The main author was the young Virginian Thomas Jefferson, a brilliant mind, an excellent writer, a man of the Enlightenment. On the 4th of July, Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. It was an amazing document. Jefferson wrote not just a list of grievances against the king, although there was plenty of that. He articulated ideas that would change the world. All men are created equal. They are endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Governments exist to protect these rights, and they derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. If a government becomes tyrannical, the people have the right to overthrow it. Revolutionary ideas in the literal sense of the word. Declaring independence proved easier than defending it. Britain was a superpower with a huge army and the most powerful navy in the world. The Americans had a motley army of farmers who came and went as they pleased, a shortage of everything, from gunpowder to clothing. The first years of the war went badly. The British captured New York, then Philadelphia. Washington retreated, lost men, and barely kept the army from collapsing. But he held on. In the winter in Trenton, he suddenly attacked the Hessian mercenaries serving Britain and won a small but important victory that lifted spirits. In the autumn of 1777, the Americans surrounded and forced an entire British army to capitulate at Saratoga. This was the turning point. Saratoga convinced France that the Americans could win. The French still dreamed of revenge against Britain for the defeat in the 7 Years' War. Now there was a chance. France recognized the independence of the USA, concluded an alliance, and began supplying weapons, money, and, most importantly, its fleet. Spain and Holland also entered the war against Britain. The conflict transformed from a colonial rebellion into a world war. The British shifted military operations to the south, capturing Georgia and the Carolinas. But guerrilla warfare wore them down. And in the autumn of 1781, the British Army, commanded by General Cornwallis, found itself trapped in Yorktown between Washington's troops on land and the French fleet at sea. Cornwallis capitulated. The war was effectively over. Negotiations dragged on for another 2 years. But in 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially recognized the independence of the United States of America. A new country was born, the first republic of the New World, built on the principles of the Enlightenment and popular sovereignty. Many challenges lay ahead, but the main thing was accomplished. The 13 colonies became one nation, free and independent.
Winning the war proved easier than figuring out what to do next. The 13 states were free, but they resembled 13 separate countries more than a unified nation. During the war, they adopted a document called the Articles of Confederation, something like a temporary constitution. It sounded good on paper, but it worked terribly. According to these articles, each state retained almost complete independence. A central government? Ridiculous. Congress could ask the states for money, but couldn't force them to pay.
It could ask for troops, but couldn't create an army. The country had no president, no judicial system, not even a standard currency. Each state printed its own money, established its own customs duties on goods from neighboring states. It wasn't a country, but chaos in 13 bottles. By the mid-80s of the 18th century, it became clear this couldn't continue. The economy was falling apart at the seams, external debts were growing, trade was stalled. In Massachusetts, a rebellion of farmers erupted, led by a former captain named Daniel Shays. People crushed by debts took up arms against courts and tax collectors. The rebellion was suppressed, but elites across the country were frightened. What if there were more Shayses? What if everything collapsed? In the summer of 1787, delegates from the states convened in Philadelphia for a convention, ostensibly to amend the Articles of Confederation. But as soon as the hall doors were locked, it became clear there was nothing to amend. A completely new system was needed. 55 people, the country's best minds, met behind closed doors all summer. George Washington presided. Benjamin Franklin, already a very old man, shared his wisdom. James Madison, a small, quiet Virginian, developed the main plan and became the chief architect of the future Constitution. They argued until hoarse. Large states wanted representation to be proportional to population. More people, more votes. Small states demanded equality. One state, one vote, regardless of size. They found a compromise: 2 houses of Congress. In the House of Representatives, votes are divided by population. In the Senate, each state gets 2 seats, and that's it. Fair? Debatable. But it works. The North and South also clashed. Southerners wanted to count slaves when determining population size to gain more seats in Congress. Northerners objected. If slaves are property, they cannot be counted as people for political purposes. An appalling 3/5 compromise emerged. Each slave was counted as 3/5 of a person. A moral atrocity. But without it, the South would not have agreed to the Constitution. On the 17th of September, 1787, the document was ready. The U.S. Constitution, a short text, just a few pages, but incredibly well thought out. The federal government gained real power to collect taxes, mint money, regulate trade, and maintain an army. But power was divided into 3 branches so that no one could become a tyrant. Legislative power, Congress; executive, the president; judicial, the Supreme Court. Each can check and balance the others. Checks and balances. A brilliant system. But many states refused to ratify the Constitution. Where were the guarantees of citizens' rights? Where was the protection of freedom of speech, religion, the press? They promised to add them, and they kept their word. In 1791, the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, were adopted. Freedom of speech, religion, assembly, the right to bear arms, protection against unlawful searches, trial by jury. These rights became sacred to Americans. In the spring of 1789, the first president was elected. Who else but Washington? He received the votes of all electors, the only time in history. Washington did not want to be president, but understood that the country needed him.
He established precedents that still work today. He assembled a cabinet of advisors. He established the tradition of peaceful transfer of power. After 2 terms, he refused to run again, showing that the president is not a king. Political parties began to form during Washington's time, although he despised them. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton wanted a strong central government, industrial development, and a national bank.
Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson dreamed of a country of free farmers, a weak government, and an agrarian society. Federalists versus Republicans. These disagreements have not disappeared to this day. The second president, John Adams, ruled for only 1 term and is remembered more for scandals than achievements. And then came Jefferson. In 1803, he made the largest real estate deal in history. He bought Louisiana from France, not just the state that now bears that name, but a huge territory from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. Napoleon needed money for European wars, and Jefferson needed room for expansion. $15 million, and the USA doubled its territory with 1 stroke of the pen. But peace with Europe did not last long. Britain and France fought each other and constantly drew American ships into their conflicts. The English stopped American vessels, seized sailors, claiming they were British subjects. This was called impressment, and it infuriated Americans to the extreme. In 1812, the young republic again declared war on Britain. The war was a disaster. The Americans tried to capture Canada and failed. The British burned Washington, including the brand new White House. But there were glorious moments: the naval victory on Lake Erie, the defense of Fort McHenry, which inspired Francis Scott Key to write The Star-Spangled Banner, the future anthem. The war ended in a stalemate, neither victors nor vanquished. Everything returned to the way it was. But Americans felt more confident. They fought Britain 2 times and survived. The country was here to stay. By the beginning of the 20s of the 19th century, America looked at the world differently. European powers were losing colonies in Latin America. Bolivar, San Martin, and other revolutionaries were freeing country after country. President James Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, decided it was time to state their position. In 1823, Monroe gave a speech that became a doctrine. The Western Hemisphere is closed to European colonization. America for Americans. Europeans, stay away. They do not interfere in the affairs of the Old World, and Europe should not interfere in the affairs of the New. This was arrogance, of course. The USA could not dictate terms to European superpowers. But the declaration was made. The young republic grew, strengthened, and the world began to notice. By the mid-19th century, Americans looked west the way you look at dessert after dinner, with impatience and the certainty that it was theirs by right. The lands beyond the Mississippi seemed endless, empty, waiting to be filled with farms, cities, railroads. What about the Mexicans and Indians already living there? That didn't count. A term even appeared for this feeling: manifest destiny. A journalist named John O'Sullivan wrote in 1845 that America was destined by fate to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. This was not just a desire or a policy, it was a divine mission, they believed. God wants American democracy and civilization to cover the entire continent. A convenient ideology if you want to take someone else's land and still feel righteous. The first big acquisition was Texas. This huge territory belonged to Mexico, a young country that had just freed itself from Spain. The Mexicans invited American settlers. Come, they said, develop the land, only abide by our laws and adopt Catholicism. Americans came in droves, but they had no intention of abiding by the laws, and even less of becoming Catholics.
By the mid-30s, there were 10 times more Americans in Texas than Mexicans. The Mexican government tried to restore order, restrict immigration, ban slavery, increase control. The settlers rebelled.
In 1836, they proclaimed the independence of Texas. Mexican general and dictator Antonio López de Santa Anna led troops to quell the rebels. At the Alamo, an old mission converted into a fort, fewer than 200 Texans held out for almost 2 weeks against several thousand Mexicans. All the defenders died, including the legendary Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie. "Remember the Alamo" became the Texans' battle cry. General Sam Houston gathered an army and defeated Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto. Texas became an independent republic. Almost immediately, it began asking to join the USA. But Washington hesitated. Accepting Texas meant war with Mexico, as well as adding another slave state, which the North disliked. Only in 1845 was Texas annexed. Mexico regarded this as an act of aggression. President James Polk, a convinced supporter of expansion, was only waiting for this. He sent troops into the disputed border zone. A skirmish occurred. Polk told Congress that Mexicans had attacked American soldiers on American territory. This was a lie, but Congress declared war in 1846. The war turned out to be short and one-sided. The American army captured California, New Mexico, and moved deep into Mexico. General Winfield Scott landed at Veracruz and reached the capital. Mexico lost completely. By the treaty in 1848, it ceded half of its territory to the USA. Modern California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. America paid $15 million for land it had already captured. Generosity. And then something happened that turned Western expansion from a slow movement of settlers into a crazy race. In January 1848, a worker named James Marshall found gold nuggets in a creek in California. The news leaked out, and the gold rush began. By the end of '49, tens of thousands of people flocked to California from all over the world. They were called the 49ers. Imagine, people quit their jobs, homes, and families. They sailed for months around South America or crossed the Isthmus of Panama, where they died of fever. They walked across the continent in wagons, along trails full of dangers, deserts, mountains, diseases, attacks. Most did not find gold. Those who got rich were the ones selling shovels, food, and whiskey to the prospectors. A German immigrant named Levi Strauss began sewing durable pants for the miners. That's how jeans appeared. But California transformed from a wasteland into a state with cities, banks, and theaters in just a few years. Farmers, cowboys, and adventurers followed the prospectors. The Wild West became a reality, not a myth. Huge herds of cattle were driven from Texas to railroad towns like Dodge City. Cowboys, mostly young men, many of whom were black and Mexican, although movies forget about this, spent months leading thousands of heads across the prairies. Towns sprang up overnight and emptied just as quickly. Saloons, sheriffs, shootouts, all of this happened, though not as romantically as shown in westerns. Railroads connected the coasts. In 1869, 2 rail lines met in Utah. One came from the east, the other from the west. The last spike was driven with a golden hammer. Now you could travel from New York to San Francisco in a week instead of half a year. The country was becoming a single space. But this story of triumph had a dark, bloody underside. The Native American peoples who had lived on these lands for millennia were in the path of American expansion, and they were simply swept aside. This began even before the gold rush.
President Andrew Jackson, in the 30s of the 19th century, began the policy of Indian removal.
The civilized tribes, Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Seminole, living in the southeast, were driven from their lands and marched beyond the Mississippi into reservations. Thousands died on the way from cold, hunger, and disease. The Cherokee called this the Trail of Tears. Hunter nations lived on the Great Plains: Sioux, Comanche, Cheyenne, Arapaho. Their lives depended on the bison, huge herds covering the prairies by the millions. Americans began slaughtering bison for hides, and sometimes simply for fun, shooting from train windows. In a few decades, the bison population was reduced from 30 million to less than 1,000. Without bison, the Indians lost the basis of their existence. The army drove them into reservations, scraps of the worst land where it was impossible to live as before. Some resisted. Chiefs like Red Cloud, Geronimo, Sitting Bull led their people into battle. There were victories. In 876, the Sioux and Cheyenne destroyed General Custer's detachment at the Battle of Little Bighorn. But this only postponed the inevitable. The army came again and again, with rifles, cannons, and the telegraph. In 890, at Wounded Knee, soldiers shot more than 200 Sioux, mostly women and children. This was the last battle of the Indian Wars. In reality, it was a massacre. By the end of the century, the Indians were confined to reservations, their languages, religions, and way of life forbidden. Children were taken to boarding schools, where they were punished for speaking Indian languages and forced to abandon their culture. Kill the Indian, save the man. That was the motto. It was cultural genocide in addition to physical genocide. Meanwhile, another problem was growing. Every new territory, every new state in the West raised the same question: slave or free? The South wanted to spread slavery westward. The North was categorically against it. Texas entered as a slave state,
California as a free state. In 1850, another compromise was adopted. California would be admitted as free, but a harsh fugitive slave law would be introduced. Any black person in the North could be seized and sent back to the South, even if they were free. Compromises did not work. With every new state, the dispute flared up more strongly. The country grew, got richer, and spread from ocean to ocean. Manifest destiny came true. But internally, it was falling apart at the seams. The issue of slavery was splitting the nation, and no temporary agreements could stop it. A storm was ahead. By the end of the 50s of the 19th century, it was clear to everyone: compromises were over. The North and South had virtually turned into two different countries living on the same territory. The North built factories, railroads, cities. Workers received wages, even if meager. The South remained an agrarian society, where a handful of planters owned enormous fortunes built on the labor of 4 million enslaved people. The Southern elite understood: if slavery was not expanded into new territories, it would die. New free states meant new senators voting against their interests. Sooner or later, the North would get enough votes to abolish slavery everywhere. For the planters, this wasn't just politics. It was a threat to their way of life, their wealth, their power. And in the North, the abolitionist movement was growing. People who considered slavery a moral evil that must be destroyed immediately. In the autumn of 1860, the Republican Abraham Lincoln ran for election. A tall, awkward lawyer from Illinois, the son of the poor, a self-taught man who rose up through his own intellect. He was not a radical abolitionist. He promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, but was categorically against its expansion westward. For the South, this was already too much.
When Lincoln was elected president, not even winning a majority of the popular vote, but winning in the Electoral College, the Southerners decided, that's it, enough. South Carolina was the first to announce its secession from the Union in December. It was followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. In the spring of 861, they created the Confederate States of America, with its capital in Montgomery and later in Richmond. They elected Jefferson Davis as president. They adopted a constitution similar to the American one, but with a direct mention of the right to own slaves. They believed they had the right to leave the Union, that the states were sovereign, and no one could keep them by force. Lincoln and the Northerners thought otherwise. The Union is indissoluble. Secession is rebellion, betrayal. But initially, no one wanted war. Maybe everything would somehow settle down. Maybe the Southerners would come to their senses. Tension grew over the federal forts located within the southern states. Most capitulated or were seized. But Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, held out. A small garrison commanded by Major Robert Anderson refused to surrender. They were running out of supplies. Lincoln decided to send ships with provisions, not weapons, not reinforcements, just food. The Southerners considered this a provocation. Early in the morning of the 12th of April, 861, the Confederates opened fire on the fort. 34 hours of shelling. The fort was in ruins, but there were no deaths, a miracle. Anderson surrendered. These were the first shots of a war that would kill more than 600,000 people, more than all other American wars combined. Lincoln declared the southern states rebellious and called for 75,000 volunteers to quell the rebellion.
In response, 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, joined the Confederacy. Virginia was key, the oldest, richest, most populous southern state. The loss of Virginia meant the war would be long and bloody. Initially, everyone thought it would end quickly. Northerners joked they would rout the Southerners in 3 months. Southerners boasted that one of their soldiers was worth 10 Yankees. Both sides were wrong. The first major battle at Bull Run ended with a shameful retreat of the Northerners back to Washington. Spectators from the capital came for a picnic to watch their army crush the rebels. They saw a catastrophe. It became clear this would be a war of attrition. The North had all the advantages: a population 3 times larger, industry, railroads, a navy. The South had better generals, a warlike spirit, and the advantage of defense. They didn't need to conquer the North. They just needed to hold on, wear out the opponent, and force them to surrender. The first 2 years went well for the Confederacy. Robert Lee, a brilliant Virginian general who refused command of the Union Army for the sake of his state, won battle after battle in the East. Northern generals seemed incompetent and indecisive. But Lincoln learned. He went through several commanders until he found one willing to fight harshly and without sentimentality, Ulysses Grant. A short man with a perpetual cigar, discharged from the army for drunkenness before the war, Grant turned out to be a strategic genius and a man of iron will. He did not retreat after defeats, was not afraid of losses, and methodically overwhelmed the enemy with numbers and resources. In the West, Grant captured Vicksburg on the Mississippi in the summer of 1863 after a long siege. This cut the Confederacy in half, severing Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas from the rest of the states.
And a few days before that, the battle that turned the tide of the war in the East took place. Gettysburg. A small town in Pennsylvania where 165,000 people met in the summer of 1863. 3 days of bloody carnage. Lee tried to break the center of the Northern line with a frontal attack across an open field. Pickett's charge. It was hell. Thousands of Confederates were mown down by artillery and rifle fire. Few reached the Northern positions, but they could not hold on. Lee lost, and retreated to Virginia. He never invaded the North again. But Lincoln understood. Military victories were not enough. The war needed a moral meaning, transforming it from a fight to preserve the Union into a fight for freedom. On the 1st of January 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Formally, it only freed slaves in rebellious states, not touching the slave states that remained loyal to the Union, such as Kentucky and Missouri. Practically, it changed almost nothing immediately, because the Confederacy did not obey Lincoln's decrees. But symbolically, it was a revolution. Now the war was fought for the abolition of slavery. The last year of the war was the cruelest. Grant received command of the entire Union Army. He and William Sherman, another Northern general, waged a war of attrition. Grant pursued Lee in Virginia, losing tens of thousands of men, but continuing to advance. Sherman marched from Atlanta to the sea through Georgia, burning everything in his path. Not just military targets, but farms, homes, railroads. Total war, it was called. The goal, to break the South's will to resist, to show that continuing the war would destroy everything they held dear. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was at its last gasp. Richmond fell. Lee, with the remnants of his army, tried to break through west, but was surrounded.
On the 9th of April, at the courthouse in Appomattox, Lee surrendered to Grant. The war ended. The Union won. But at what cost? 620,000 dead. That's a conservative estimate. The real figure might be higher. The percentage of the population is terrifying. 1 out of every 50 Americans would die in this war. A whole generation of men was decimated. The South was in ruins. Cities burned, plantations abandoned, the economy destroyed. The North won, but it too was exhausted, although its industry and cities remained intact. Lincoln did not live to enjoy the victory. On the 14th of April, 5 days after Lee's capitulation, an actor and fanatic named John Wilkes Booth shot the president in a theater. The country was left without a leader at the most critical moment, when it was necessary to decide how to reunite the torn nation. Reconstruction began, an attempt to rebuild the South and integrate 4 million freed slaves into society. 3 amendments were adopted to the Constitution. The 13th abolished slavery, the 14th granted black people citizenship, and the 15th granted the right to vote for men regardless of race. On paper, everything looked progressive. In practice, Reconstruction failed. The South resisted with all its might. Secret organizations like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, terrorizing black people and white Republicans. Southern states adopted black codes, laws that formally did not restore slavery, but severely restricted the rights of former slaves. By the end of the 70s of the 19th century, the North grew tired of Reconstruction, withdrew its troops, and left black people at the mercy of local white elites. The Jim Crow era began, a system of racial segregation that would last for almost a century. The war preserved the Union and destroyed slavery. But it did not create equality or solve the racial issue. This wound would remain open for generations to come. And America emerged from the war transformed, more industrial, more centralized, ready to become a world power. After the war, the country was devastated, but simultaneously full of energy. 4 years of bloodshed taught Americans many things: how to produce weapons on an industrial scale, how to organize logistics, how to move armies by rail. These skills were now directed towards creation, not destruction. And something amazing began. The country transformed from an agrarian republic into an industrial giant in just about 30 years. Railroads became the arteries of the new America. Before the war, they connected cities in the east and went slightly west. Afterward,
transcontinental lines began to be built, connecting the coasts. In 1869, as we recall, two lines met in Utah. But that was just the beginning. By the end of the century, America had more railroad tracks than the rest of the world combined. Trains carried people, goods, and dreams. Western lands opened up for mass settlement. Cows from Texas ended up at the Chicago slaughterhouses. Wheat from the plains to New York, and from there to Europe. And who built these roads? Chinese coolies in the West, Irish immigrants in the East. They worked for pennies in deadly, dangerous conditions. They blasted mountains with dynamite, laid tracks through snowy passes where people froze to death right on the job. Thousands died so America could be connected by rails. At the same time, people appeared who were called by different names, captains of industry or robber barons, depending on who you asked. John Rockefeller started with a modest oil refining company in Cleveland. By the 80s, his Standard Oil controlled 90% of the country's oil refining. How? Through ruthless competition. He negotiated discounts with railroads, suffocated competitors, bought up bankrupt companies for next to nothing. He created the first true monopolistic trust.
Rockefeller became the wealthiest man in human history, if his fortune is calculated relative to the country's economy. Andrew Carnegie came to America as a poor Scottish boy. He worked in a factory for pennies, as a telegraph operator, then a railroad clerk. He got rich in steel production. His mills in Pittsburgh produced more steel than all of Great Britain. Carnegie introduced new technologies, pressured workers, and demanded maximum efficiency. Carnegie's steel built skyscrapers, bridges, railroads, the very infrastructure of modern America. John Morgan produced nothing material. He produced money. A banker who financed railroads, industrial corporations, and entire sectors of the economy. His bank became so powerful that during the financial panic of 1907, it was Morgan who saved the country's economy from collapse by gathering other bankers and forcing them to invest money in the crumbling system. The government asked him for help. One man was more powerful than the state. These magnates reveled in luxury that is hard to imagine. Mansions the size of palaces, yachts the length of ships, private railway cars decorated with gold and mahogany. The writer Mark Twain named this era the Gilded Age, shining gilding on the outside, concealing rot within. Because the underside was horrible. Millions of factory workers toiled 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, for meager wages. Child labor was the norm. Children aged about 6 or 7 worked in mines, textile factories, and on the streets. Safety regulations? Never heard of them. People lost hands in machines, died from mine collapses, breathed toxic air in chemical production facilities. They lived in overcrowded slums without plumbing or sewage. A wave of immigrants flooded into the cities. If previously they mainly came from Britain, Germany, and Scandinavia, now they came from Italy, Poland, Russian Jews, Greeks, Hungarians. Tens of millions of people over a few decades. They settled in ethnic neighborhoods, Little Italy, Chinatown, the Jewish Lower East Side. They preserved languages, traditions, and cuisine. America was turning into a melting pot of cultures. Workers began to organize. Trade unions emerged, fighting for an 8-hour workday, decent wages, and safe working conditions. Owners responded harshly, hiring private armies like the Pinkerton Agency, breaking up strikes with force, bribing politicians. At Haymarket in Chicago, police opened fire on strikers. At a steel mill in Homestead, Carnegie's troops fought striking workers. A real battle with dozens of dead.
The system slowly changed, but every improvement had to be ripped out with blood. By the end of the 19th century, America looked beyond its borders. The continent was conquered, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The economy had become the largest in the world, and European powers were dividing Africa and Asia among themselves. Why shouldn't the USA also become an empire? An excuse was found in Cuba. The Spanish colony rebelled against the mother country. American newspapers, especially those owned by magnates William Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, wrote about Spanish atrocities, often fabricating details. Yellow press fueled war hysteria. When the American battleship Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, probably due to an accident, newspapers blamed Spain. "Remember the Maine" became the new battle cry. The War of 1898 lasted less than 4 months and was a complete rout of Spain. The American fleet destroyed Spanish squadrons in Manila Bay in the Philippines and off Santiago de Cuba. The army landed in Cuba. Future President Theodore Roosevelt led his Rough Riders in the charge up San Juan Hill and became a national hero. Spain capitulated, ceding Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the USA. Hawaii was annexed in the same year. America became a colonial power, whether it liked it or not.
Filipinos, however, thought they were fighting for independence from Spain, not for a change of master. A cruel guerrilla war began, costing the lives of hundreds of thousands of Filipinos. The USA suppressed the resistance in a few years, showing that imperialism is a bloody business wherever it is practiced. Theodore Roosevelt, who became president in 1901 after the assassination of his predecessor, formulated his foreign policy doctrine simply: speak softly, but carry a big stick. Diplomacy from a position of strength. He decided that America needed a canal across the Isthmus of Panama, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Panama belonged to Colombia. Don't want to sell? Not a problem. The USA supported Panamanian separatists who declared independence. Colombia tried to suppress the rebellion, but American warships stood in the way. Panama became independent and immediately sold the canal zone to the USA. The canal was built in 10 years, a miracle of engineering that cost the lives of thousands of workers from malaria and yellow fever. By the beginning of the 20th century, America was no longer just a large country. It was a great power. Industrial might surpassed Britain and Germany. The fleet patrolled 2 oceans. Colonies stretched from the Caribbean to the Western Pacific. The population exceeded 75 million. The world was beginning to realize the American century was just beginning. In the summer of 1914, Europe plunged into madness. Empires that had accumulated weapons, ambitions, and mutual hatred finally found a reason to clash. The assassination of the Austrian Archduke in Sarajevo triggered a chain reaction of alliances, and within a few weeks, half the continent was ablaze. Germany and Austria-Hungary against France, Russia, and Britain. Trenches stretched from the English Channel to Switzerland. Millions of people died for scraps of churned mud.
America watched this slaughter from the other side of the ocean and thanked God for the Atlantic. President Woodrow Wilson, a former professor and idealist, declared neutrality. "This is a European war," he said, "not ours." Most Americans agreed. Why get involved in someone else's quarrels? The country was full of immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Italy. Each group sympathized with their old homeland. Better to stay out and trade with everyone. But neutrality proved difficult. American companies sold weapons, food, and materials to the British and French. Germany couldn't buy anything due to the British naval blockade. The Germans declared a submarine warfare zone around Britain. Any ship Even a merchant vessel could be sunk without warning. In 1915, a German submarine torpedoed the passenger liner Lusitania. More than 1,000 people died, including 128 Americans. The country seethed with outrage, but Wilson kept the nation out of war for 2 more years. By the beginning of the 17th year, the situation changed. The Germans resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking everything. British intelligence intercepted a telegram in which Germany offered Mexico an alliance against the USA with the promise to return Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona after victory. When newspapers published this, public opinion exploded. In April 1917, Congress declared war. America entered the conflict with an army smaller than Belgium's. They had to urgently implement conscription, train millions of recruits, and build ships to transport them across the ocean. By the summer of 18, troops began arriving in France, fresh, enthusiastic young men who had no idea what trench warfare was like. They learned quickly. American troops arrived at a critical moment. Russia withdrew from the war after the Revolution. Germany transferred all forces to the Western Front and nearly broke the Allies.
But fresh American divisions stopped the offensive, then went on the counterattack. By the autumn of 18, the Allies were driving the Germans back. Germany, exhausted by 4 years of war, sued for peace. On the 11th of November, 1918, the guns fell silent. Wilson arrived in Paris for the peace conference like a messiah. He was greeted by cheering crowds. Europeans saw him as the man who saved them and would now build a better world. Wilson brought his 14 points, a plan for the post-war order based on the self-determination of peoples, open diplomacy, and free trade. The main point was the creation of the League of Nations, an international organization meant to prevent future wars. European leaders listened politely, nodded, and did things their way. France wanted to crush Germany so it could never rise again. Britain wanted to preserve its empire. The Treaty of Versailles turned out to be punitive and vengeful. Germany was forced to admit guilt, stripped of colonies, and burdened with reparations it couldn't pay. New states were created, often without asking the people if they wanted them. The seeds of the next war were planted. Wilson returned home disappointed. But with the League of Nations, at least something was saved. He was confident. The Senate would ratify the treaty, and America would lead the new world order. He was wrong. The Senate rejected the treaty and the League. Americans were tired of idealism, tired of Europe, tired of war. They wanted normal life. The country plunged into isolationism. Let Europe sort itself out. We did enough. Meanwhile, a strange era began internally. In 1920, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution came into effect. Prohibition. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol became illegal. Temperance activists finally got their way. Alcohol is the root of all evil, they said. Prohibit it, and the country will be purified. The opposite happened. Americans didn't stop drinking. They started drinking illegally. Speakeasies, underground bars entered by password, appeared across the country. Bootleggers brought whiskey from Canada, rum from the Caribbean. Gangsters seized the alcohol business. It was too profitable to leave to petty criminals. Al Capone in Chicago built an empire on bootlegging, earning millions, killing rivals, and bribing police and politicians. Organized crime flourished. Police were drowned in corruption. Prohibition turned ordinary people into criminals and made gangsters rich. But that was only part of the strangeness of the 20s, because at the same time, the country experienced an incredible boom. The economy soared.
Industry, fine-tuned during the war, now produced refrigerators, radios, and cars. Henry Ford made the automobile accessible to the middle class. His Model T cost less than $1,000. Millions of families bought cars, suburban homes, and household appliances. A society of mass consumption emerged. Buy now, pay later, on credit. Culture exploded. Jazz, born in the black neighborhoods of New Orleans, swept the country. Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, black musicians created a new sound, syncopated, improvisational, sexy. White youth went crazy for jazz. They danced the Charleston and speakeasies until morning. Girls cut their hair short and wore dresses above the knee, smoked in public, kissed in cars. Parents threw up their hands. The youth had gone mad. Hollywood turned into a dream factory. Silent films became mass entertainment. Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks were the first true movie stars. People crowded theaters, watched the screen, and dreamed of a glamorous life. By the end of the 20s, sound film arrived, and the industry soared even higher. Radio connected the country. Families gathered around receivers to listen to news, music, and radio plays.
Advertising became an art. Companies learned to sell not just goods, but a lifestyle, a dream, status. Consume, consume, consume. That was the motto of the era. The stock market grew like mushrooms. Everyone played stocks: taxi drivers, maids, professors. They bought on margin, using other stocks as collateral. Prices rose because they were rising, in a speculative bubble detached from reality. Some warned of danger. They were not listened to. On the 24th of October, 1929, Black Thursday, the bubble burst. Panic on the stock market. On the 29th of October, Black Tuesday, a complete collapse. Billions of dollars in stock value evaporated in a few days. Investors went broke, banks collapsed, companies went bankrupt. The Roaring Twenties ended with a crash. Ahead was the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis in the country's history. The fun was over. The reckoning for a decade of excess, speculation, and illusions began. America, which had just seemed invincible, suddenly found itself standing on the edge of an abyss. The country was at rock bottom. 13 million unemployed. Banks collapsed. Factories stood idle. Farmers lost their land. People stood in lines for free soup, lived in shanty towns made of cardboard and tin, which were mockingly called Hoovervilles, after the previous president who failed to cope with the disaster. It seemed capitalism was dead, and democracy was next. In the spring of '33, Franklin Delano Roosevelt came to power, an aristocrat by birth, paralyzed below the waist by polio, but with an iron will and infectious optimism. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," he said in his inaugural address, and he began to act. The first 100 days of his presidency were a whirlwind of laws and reforms. He declared a bank holiday, inspected all banks, closed the rotten ones, and strengthened the healthy ones. He created public works programs. People built roads, bridges, schools, and dams, and received wages. He launched a program to help farmers. He repealed prohibition, striking a blow against gangsters and replenishing the budget with alcohol taxes. He introduced a minimum wage, maximum working hours, and the right for workers to form unions. He created the Social Security system, old age pensions, unemployment benefits. This was the New Deal, a fundamental break with the past. The government stopped merely regulating the economy from the sidelines. It actively intervened, saved, built, and hired. Conservatives screamed about socialism. Radicals demanded going further. Roosevelt balanced, maneuvered, and experimented. Not everything worked, but enough to pull the country out of the abyss. By the end of the 30s, unemployment fell, production grew, and people once again believed in the future. And in Europe, darkness was gathering again. Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, militarists in Japan. Fascism was sweeping the world. In 1939, Germany attacked Poland. A new world war began. America watched across the ocean with alarm, but most wanted to stay out. They remembered the trenches of the First World War, remembered how Europeans didn't appreciate the sacrifices. Congress passed neutrality laws, no weapons to belligerents. Roosevelt understood. If Hitler conquered Europe, America would be in mortal danger. He bypassed the laws as much as he could. First, he allowed the Allies to buy weapons for cash, the cash and carry principle. Then, when France fell and Britain was left alone against the Nazis, he launched the Lend-Lease program, giving weapons, equipment, and food on loan, under the promise to return them after the war. America became the arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt said. Formally neutral, factually fighting on the side of Britain and later the USSR. On the 7th of December, 1941, everything was decided.
Japanese planes attacked the American naval base Pearl Harbor in Hawaii without declaring war. In 2 hours, 8 battleships were sunk or damaged, hundreds of planes were destroyed, and more than 2,000 people were killed. America woke up in a rage. On the 8th of December, Congress declared war on Japan. A few days later, Germany and Italy, allies of Japan, declared war on the USA. Isolationism ended instantly. The country mobilized at incredible speed. Factories switched from cars to tanks, from refrigerators to bombers. Women went to work in factories, replacing men who had gone to the front. The economy, just emerging from the Depression, soared. Military orders gave everyone work. In 4 years of war, the USA would produce more weapons, tanks, planes, and ships than all other countries combined. Industrial power would decide the outcome of the war. They had to fight on 2 fronts, 10,000 kilometers apart. In the Pacific, the American fleet slowly, island by island, pushed toward Japan. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Names written in blood. The Japanese fought to the last man, sending kamikazes on suicidal attacks. Each island cost thousands of lives. In Europe, the Allies first landed in North Africa, defeating the Germans and Italians. Then Sicily, mainland Italy, a slow, bloody advance north. And the main blow waited for its time. On the 6th of June, 1944, D-Day, the landing in Normandy began. The largest amphibious operation in history. 150,000 soldiers on thousands of ships stormed the fortified French coast. The Germans met them with fire. The water at Omaha Beach turned red, but the beachhead was secured. Through France, the Allied armies, Americans, British, Canadians, French, advanced on Germany. The Red Army advanced from the east, having paid the highest price in this war. In the spring of 45, Soviet troops took Berlin. Hitler shot himself in a bunker.
On the 8th of May, Germany capitulated. The European war ended. But Japan fought on. American command planned an invasion of the main Japanese islands. They predicted 1 million losses on their side, tens of millions of Japanese casualties, military and civilian. And then the USA had a card that no one knew about, except for a small circle. The Manhattan Project, a secret program to create the atomic bomb. $2 billion, thousands of scientists, including refugees from occupied Europe, cities built specifically for this project. On the 16th of July, 45, the first bomb was detonated in the New Mexico desert. Witnesses described a light brighter than 1,000 suns.
the world entered the atomic age. On the 6th of August, a bomber dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The city vanished in fire. 70,000 died instantly. Tens of thousands died later from wounds and radiation. On the 9th of August, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. Japan capitulated. The war ended. Atomic weapons were born, a force capable of destroying civilization. America emerged from the war a completely different country, the only major power whose territory was not damaged. The economy was not only not destroyed, but more powerful than before the war. Half of the world's industrial production was American. The dollar, backed by gold, became the world currency under the Bretton Woods agreements, adopted even during the war. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were created to stabilize the economy and finance reconstruction. Europe lay in ruins. Cities were bombed, factories destroyed, millions of refugees, a shortage of food and fuel. Without aid, the continent could descend into chaos. Secretary of State George Marshall proposed a plan, $13 billion for the reconstruction of Europe. The Marshall Plan. Not charity, but pragmatism. A prosperous Europe would become a market for American goods, an ally against the growing threat from the USSR.
The plan worked in a few years. Western Europe recovered, became rich and democratic. The United Nations organization was created, a new attempt at international cooperation, taking into account the failure of the League of Nations. The headquarters in New York, a symbol of America's new role. Not isolationism, but global leadership. By the end of the 40s, the layout was clear. Two superpowers, the USA and the USSR. But American superiority was obvious. Economic power was incomparable. Atomic monopoly, even if temporary. A network of allies around the world. America became what the Founding Fathers did not want, a world empire. Not colonial like the British one, but an empire of a different type. Economic, military, and cultural domination without direct governance. The American century had truly begun, and it would define everything that happened next. The alliance between the USA and the USSR against Hitler was a marriage of convenience that fell apart the moment of victory. The two superpowers looked at each other across the ruins of Europe with increasing suspicion. Capitalism versus communism, democracy versus totalitarianism, free market versus planned economy. No middle ground. Churchill gave a speech about the Iron Curtain descending across Europe. Diplomat George Kennan formulated the doctrine of containment. Communism must not be allowed to spread further, anywhere in the world. In 1949, NATO was created, a military alliance of Western countries. The USSR responded with the Warsaw Pact. Europe split into two camps. The war remained cold because both sides had atomic weapons. By the beginning of the 50s, the USSR also created the bomb, then the hydrogen bomb, then rockets. The doctrine of mutual guaranteed destruction. Any war between the superpowers meant the end of civilization. Therefore, they fought by proxy in foreign countries. Korea split after the war into the communist North and the pro-Western South. In 1950, the North attacked. The USA, leading a UN coalition, entered the war. China supported the North. 3 years of carnage ended in a stalemate. The border returned to where it was. But the precedent was set. America will fight anywhere to stop communism. In Vietnam, everything went worse. The USA supported the corrupt Southern regime against the communist North. They sent advisors, then troops, then even more troops. By the end of the 60s, there were 500,000 American soldiers there. They fought in the jungle against guerrillas, couldn't distinguish the enemy from civilians, burned villages with napalm, and lost a war of attrition. At home, television showed corpses, coffins, and protests. Young people burned draft cards, chanting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" The country fractured. In 1973, the troops were withdrawn. In 1975, Saigon fell.
The First War, America lost.
Meanwhile, there were moments when the world stood on the brink. In '62, the USSR placed missiles in Cuba, 100 kilometers from Florida. Young President John Kennedy ordered a blockade of the island. Soviet ships approached. American military demanded an attack. The world froze. 13 days on the verge of nuclear war. Khrushchev and Kennedy negotiated. The missiles were removed. Catastrophe was avoided. The Cuban Missile Crisis showed the game had gone too far. Rules must be established. They competed everywhere. In space, too. The Soviet Sputnik in '57 shocked America. The Reds were ahead. Gagarin was the first man in space. The USA frantically poured money into the space program. Kennedy promised, by the end of the '60s, Americans would be on the moon. In '69, Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface. One small step for a man, a giant leap for mankind, and a massive propaganda victory for America. Inside the country, things were also volatile. Black Americans, formerly free for a century, remained second-class citizens in the South.
Segregation in schools, buses, restaurants. The Civil Rights Movement, led by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., fought with nonviolent protest, sit-ins, marches, boycotts. King dreamed of an America judged by character, not by the color of their skin. In '64, the Civil Rights Act was passed, prohibiting discrimination. Progress was made, but it was slow, painful, and incomplete. On the 22nd of November '63, Kennedy was shot in Dallas. The country was in shock. Conspiracy theories were born immediately and live on today. But life continued. Vietnam, race riots, the hippie counterculture, the Watergate scandal that brought down President Nixon. Turbulent times. By the '80s, the USSR was exhausted. The economy, built on mandates rather than incentives, stalled. The arms race devoured the budget. President Reagan accelerated the process by announcing the Star Wars program, missile defense that the USSR could not afford. Gorbachev tried to reform the system. Instead, it collapsed. In '89, the Berlin Wall fell. In '91, the USSR dissolved. The Cold War ended. The USA won without a single shot fired on its territory. A unipolar world dawned. No rivals. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in '90, the USA led a coalition, routing the Iraqi army in 100 hours of ground operations. Desert Storm showcased the new face of war: precision-guided weapons, night vision, air superiority. Everything was shown on television like a video game. The '90s were a decade of triumph: economic boom, the internet revolution, cultural dominance. Hollywood, pop music, McDonald's, and Coca-Cola worldwide. The dollar was not just a world currency, but the foundation of the global financial system. Francis Fukuyama wrote about the end of history. Liberal democracy had won. There were no alternatives. It seemed the American century would be eternal.
On the 11th of September, 2001, 2 planes crashed into the Twin Towers in New York, a third into the Pentagon, and a fourth crashed in a field. Almost 3,000 dead. Al-Qaeda terrorists attacked symbols of American power. The country was in rage and fear. President Bush declared a war on terrorism, global, indefinite, without clear rules. They invaded Afghanistan, overthrew the Taliban regime that harbored the terrorists. Then, in 2003, they invaded Iraq under the false pretense of weapons of mass destruction. They overthrew Saddam Hussein. They got stuck in both countries for decades, spent trillions of dollars, lost thousands of lives, without achieving a clear victory. By the beginning of the 21st century, America remained the hegemon, the largest economy, the strongest military, cultural domination, the dollar as the basis of world trade. But cracks appeared: the rise of China, the resources of Russia, terrorism, polarization within the country. The unipolar world proved to be an illusion. The world was changing, and America's place in it was too. The era of undeniable hegemony was coming to an end, although few wanted to admit it.